Hello everyone, welcome back to American Politics, and today we're going to look at the Cabinet, and within that the Cabinet Secretary, and we're going to ask, is the Cabinet Secretary's lot a happy one? And I've kind of preempted that with the subtitle of this presentation, but hey, let's push on anyway. And we're going to start by looking at the UK, and in the UK, Cabinet is the supreme executive authority. It has collective responsibility. It's responsible for executive decision making. Yes, within that, the individual cabinet member has responsibility for his administrative duties. But the whole point of this, the fact that this is where the action is, means that in the UK, government is the only game in town, and within that, cabinet is very definitely the Premier League. The number of MPs who've decided to carve out a career for themselves in the backbenches can be counted on the fingers of one hand. In fact, I can only really think of two, and they were both in charge of the Home Affairs Select Committee. We've currently got Keith Vaz, who's been chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee since the retirement of the previous Home Affairs Select Committee chairman. It was Chris Mullin. Now, the interesting thing about Chris Mullin is that he was very high-minded, very principled, fundamentally decent guy, did a great job running the Home Affairs Select Committee. But not even he could resist the siren call of government. Not once, but twice Blair came coming. The first time it ended badly and he slunk back to the chairman of the select committee. And second time it came again, and in spite of everything, he did it again. He took the shilling, he went back into government, and this time it ended even worse. And he was spun out of that and yet managed to find himself back on the Home Affairs Select Committee until he resigned from that and as an MP in the 2010 election. So, in the United Kingdom, government is the only game in town, and within that, most backbenchers will be trying to hack their way up to a ministerial post, if at all possible. So let's come across to the United States. Now, in the United States, the situation is very, very different. Supreme executive authority and responsibility for those decisions rests behind the desk in the Oval Office. It is the president, so we can get away with those. The cabinet is not the supreme executive authority. It has a minor advisory role, but really what it's all about is this administrative role. It's all about running that department. You need to run that department. Now, in so doing, you need to conform to certain preconceived ideas. Now, Bill Clinton famously said he wanted a cabinet that looked like America. And as a result of that, we have this preconceived notion that it should contain a variety of races and sex and gender, etc., etc., etc. So, identity politics is a big issue when it comes to picking your cabinet secretaries. And in addition to that, they need to serve as a go-between between the president and the federal bureaucracy in Congress. Now, within all of this, there needs to be a degree of competence. And when we come to look at Hagel as well, we'll see that he was perhaps a little lacking in this competence. Sorry, not just petans. So competence. So Chuck Hagel, who he? Well, let's have a look. Here he is. He was the defense secretary between 2013 and 2015. He was a Republican. This was an opportunity for Obama to reach across the partisan divide. But that was about all he really achieved. Anyway, before we get into that, this was his job. His job was basically to run the defense administration. He's the defense secretary, and this is the defense department, and it lives in the Pentagon, which once upon a time certainly was the world's largest office building. It may still be, I'm not entirely sure. So that was his job, but he had other roles attached to that, and one of the critical ones was to implement policy. He would receive policy from the president and then relay that on to the administration or the federal bureaucracy. These may be in the form of executive orders or just simple policy statements. Yes, you may say, but in return for that, he gets to advise the president on that policy. And no is the answer. Most of the advice for that policy would come from the West Wing, what we might call EXOP, the executive office of the president, the West Wing, these private support staff that the president has that advise him on all sorts of key issues. For example, this man here is Andrew Card. And in case you're wondering why he looks so serious and why Bush 43 looks so utterly stunned, this is the moment at which Andrew Card tells the president that a plane has just flown into one of the towers in Manhattan. So the advice that formulates the policy comes from the West Wing. There may occasionally be a little flow of information that way, but don't bet on it. The other thing, of course, that he has to do is convey that policy to Congress, and that's about as much fun as it sounds, particularly when in the other direction he has to take that legislation that comes from Congress and both apply it to his department and try to sell it back to the president. Now, this is one of the key things. Why does he have to sell the legislation back to the president? Well, because the president has to sign it. And he's going to be responsible. He's going to be in the middle if the president refuses to sign it and the veto gets involved. He's going to be a key part in trying to resolve whatever problems arise from that, because he is the Secretary of State responsible for the implementation of that particular legislation. So, legislation coming in one direction, policy going in the other, he is stuck in the middle. And it doesn't end there, because we've now got to look at this little thing up here in the top right hand corner. What on earth is going on here, you may ask? Well, I'm glad you do. I shall explain to you. This is the defense questions. This is Chuck Hagel being hauled in front of Congress to answer questions about what the department is up to, how much money they're going to need, and what exactly is going on. And this is all about accountability and scrutiny. Now, Hagel, or the defense secretary, has absolutely no influence in that direction. He has very little authority in terms of White House support staff, because of course he does not work in the White House, and so he has absolutely no call on these guys at all. These guys are accountable only to the president, and that is that. You can't really say much more than that. What we can say is that the president or the executive has to account for itself in front of Congress, but of course the president would have to be insane to do that, and so instead he sends out his defense secretary. So the defense secretary now has to go and account not only for the actions of his own department, but also for any policy decisions or policy fiascos that the president might have created. And we can start to see here that really, when it comes to it, this is not a particularly pleasant job. You've got a duo flying in all directions, and you're sitting in the middle, taking it both from Congress and from the president, and indeed for your own administration, and then having to apologize for the mistakes that are being made here, here, and here. That all becomes your responsibility, and when you're hauled up in front of Congress to answer for those, they're not going to hold the punches. They're not going to hold back and say, well, actually, this wasn't your mistake. This was the president's mistake, or it was their mistake, or it was just the fact that these guys bombed a hospital instead of a terrorist training camp. Doesn't matter. You are responsible for all of that. So if we were to say, for example, that the president decides he needs to have drones going out killing people, well, that policy will have been advised here. So we have a drone policy here. The drone policy goes, it's now policy, that comes to you. You then have to implement it. So you have to go to Congress and say, we're going to start using drones. You then have to give to these guys, so right now it's time for you to start using drones, and they'll obviously be delighted, because there's nothing the army likes more than more toys. Now, the problem is you then have to account for that policy before the Senate, before Congress. And then if, instead of bombing training camps, these guys accidentally bomb a hospital, in case you're just wondering, the Americans have just bombed a hospital in Afghanistan. Good work. Well, you are going to have to answer for their mistakes as well. So you're dealing with problems of policy, you're dealing with problems of administration, and what you've got is just a monumentally thankless task. There is, of course, an exception. And the exception is the Bush administration. So if we say that cabinet is all about management, while the executive office is all about decision making, there may be certain special circumstances that tend to change this. And that special circumstance is this. You have a president who really doesn't know what he's doing. The whole reasons why we wound up with Bush in charge of the White House are long and complicated, but they can be summed up in the idea of the neoconservative movement. The neocons was a group that essentially infiltrated, well, it didn't infiltrate, it coagulated within the Tea Party. And I suppose in some senses you can think of it as being not entirely dissimilar in that sense to the Tea Party, the way in which the Tea Party has sort of emerged from within the wider Republican Party. The difference really is that the aims and goals of the Tea Party relative to the neoconservative group are very, very restricted. The Tea Party really wants to drop the drawbridge, pull up the drawbridge, and just focus on the United States and focus on drawing down government, restricting government. The neocons had a much more ambitious goal. What they were interested in was reshaping the entirety of the state in American interests, and that was really the driving idea behind the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course they went spectacularly well, and the world is now a safer and happier place, and we've got really the neocons to thank for that. Now, we can see the neocons at work when we look here at the cabinet. What we have here is certain key members of the neoconservative movement, specifically Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Ashcroft. Now, these guys were working very, very closely with these people over here. These were all part of what we might call the neoconservative cabal. A cabal is simply a sort of group within a group. And unusually, under Bush 43, we had this network of influence that crossed the divide between cabinet and exop. So this defied conventional wisdom. And instead of being able to say, well, cabinet is a waste of space and all the power lies in the executive office of the president, the power was concentrated within a web of influence that stretched between the executive office and the White House. Very, very interesting situation, and very, very much the exception that proves the rule. And these guys here at Defense proved to be incredibly important in terms of shaping American policy. They were very much driving American policy along, of course, with the eminence grise himself, Mr. Cheney. Now, that's a complicated slide, and it's now covered in lots of scribbling, so I anticipate you're going to have some questions to raise about that, and I look forward to answering them. Before we do that, this is the summary of where we've got to. The problems that you've got as a cabinet secretary in the United States is that you're probably there for token grounds or for identity politics. You're there either to bridge internal gaps within the party or external gaps to go across the divide and try to effect some sort of bipartisan gesture politics. You're also there, administration, you're going to be there to manage your department, so you better be good at that, and that means implementing executive policy, usually through exhorts. But your other job is, of course, to liaise between POTUS and Congress and to liaise in the other direction, and you're there to basically answer for executive policy. You're there to carry the can for the president in terms of the decisions he's made, and of course you are answerable for the way in which your department has implemented that decision. And so you're there to both defend the drone policy in general and the fact that your department has just bombed a hospital instead of a training camp. And it can all really be summed up in this chap here. This is Robert Gates. He was Defense Secretary between 2006 and 2011. People have no idea how much I detest this job. Can you imagine a cabinet secretary in the United Kingdom saying that? Can you imagine Fallon turning around and saying, this business with Defense Secretary, it's not worth a candle? Now, that simply isn't going to happen, but there you go. That's just another illustration of how radically similar and yet different our two systems are. That's it for this particular presentation. I look forward to your questions, and I'll deal with them as soon as they come up.